All right. So
Okay,
all of that being
let's
said,
get to it.
Sagar, there's some interesting polls out this morning about how people are feeling about Afghanistan.
So this is a very important development here, which a lot of people are trying to spin. Now, let's go ahead and put this NBC News tear sheet up there on the screen, which shows that the drop in job rating decline for Biden is precipitous. Now, they put in the headline amid COVID surge, Afghan withdrawal in the NBC News. This is important because even NBC is calling this, quote, the summer of discontent when Biden's approval rating is falling through 50% of the first time. And remember the Krystal and Saagar rule, which is that any public poll, you should just add +4 to +6 of Republican support, given the fact that we basically didn't see a lot of that show up in the 2020 election. But what I want to point people towards is the actual declines for Biden on COVID. And that Afghanistan, Krystal, really doesn't have a lot to do with his job approval ratings. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. Mark Murray. So what he shows there is that Biden's job approval around all adults, 49%, and it was 53 in April. Disapproval, 48, was 39. So that's a 9-point increase in the explicit disapproval rating. And registered voters, relatively stable from 50 to 51. But the overall disapproval number, I think, is really getting at something which is important. But, friend of the show, Batya, let's go ahead and put her tweet up there on the screen because I think she captured this, what I want to get across to everybody, which is that the drop for Biden, yes, people don't necessarily approve of Afghanistan, but the 16-point drop in his handling of COVID is what has really led to his drop in approval. As she says, showing once more how the national media's views pro-COVID restrictions and furious about Afghanistan are the opposite of most Americans. And I think that absolutely captures the dynamic. We're about to get to school masking and pandemic restriction and more. But I really do believe, Krystal, that the discontent in this country, I think really amongst people like us, as well as many diehards, people who went out, got vaccinated, did what they were supposed to do, but are still living with a lot of hysteria, a lot of talking about, different restrictions and more, are not grappling with the fact that this could be a real uprising against Biden, and that Biden, by really, in my opinion, kind of caving to the public health establishment, is doing himself and the Democrats no favors come election time in 2022.
My interpretation is quite a bit different because if you look at it, the numbers are still very much in favor of, things like masking. Even vaccine mandates are more popular than honestly I would have expected. But I think some of this is Biden's fault, and I think some of it is out of his control. There is a segment of the population that doesn't want to get vaccinated, and it really doesn't matter what Joe Biden says or does outside of a vaccine mandate, which would be incredibly controversial. To get those people vaccinated. And that means that we are having a surge in coronavirus cases, as we are personally experiencing, although your vaccination status doesn't have anything to do with that. So some of that is kind of out of his hands. The part that is in his hands that I fully blame him for is that if you look into some of these numbers, there's a large number of the American people who think that he is not getting much done. And I think that criticism at this point is fair, because he took so long, he was so obsessed with getting this bipartisan deal done that it has really hamstrung the rest of his agenda. Not to mention that he's decided to defer to the parliamentarian. He's decided to keep the existing Senate rules with regards to the filibuster in place. He's decided not to put pressure on Manchin. And so there is a sense of like, he's stuck. And the other pieces that were promised to the American people to help them and to continue to move the economy forward, not just to get out of COVID, but beyond, those have not come to fruition. That is completely on him. And I think that's part of why you see this backsliding in both his handling of the coronavirus and also backsliding in terms of his handling of the economy. What I will say to your point is the people who do oppose the COVID restrictions are extremely motivated. Now, that matters a lot in the midterms, right?
Yes.
Which side is really amped up and really motivated. And I do think that's an issue for him. Part of why I thought it was really important, and I believe you feel the same, for us to do this analysis of the polls, which you should always take with a real grain of salt, is because we know the way the media is going to spin this. Look, I think Democrats are probably kind of screwed for the midterms, partly because of history, right? The party in power typically does poorly in midterms, partly because of COVID, partly because they didn't take more aggressive action to take control of things like redistricting so that they had a more level playing field by which they could perform in the midterm. So I do think that they're in big trouble in terms of maintaining control of the House, certainly, and the Senate quite possibly as well. The media is going to say that's because of Afghanistan. And that's just not the case.
Yes.
If you ask voters in this NBC News poll, one of the things that they found is that Afghanistan is nowhere on people's list of the issues that are most important to them. For better or worse, because we care a lot about foreign policy here, but for better or worse, most Americans are more focused on domestic policy. That is likely to be what they vote based on and whether they decide to show up at the polls or not in the midterm elections. So if Democrats ultimately lose the House and lose the Senate, and the media goes all in on, oh, it's because he actually withdrew from Afghanistan, something that 2/3 of the American people support, and they try to pin the blame on that decision, you will have the data to know why that is complete BS.
Absolutely. And friend of the show, Trita Parsi, highlighted, brand new poll that actually came out with amid the, worst of the withdrawal. Let's go ahead and put his tweet up there on the screen. Despite implementation problems, 60% of Americans continue to support withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is a poll conducted from August 17th to 19th. So think about what exactly was going on in those days, actually only 4 or 5 days ago, for Joe Biden's sake. But only 22% oppose Biden's decision, and 67% want to prioritize domestic policy issues over foreign policy. So all we can do is underscore again and again, as you point out. And I think your interpretation makes quite a bit of sense, because here's the counter to it, which is that if you're going to have a bunch of restrictions, then the only way to really make sure that that's okay with people is to deliver a massive domestic political agenda, right? Yeah. And that's not happening. So he has the worst of it. So then what do people choose? They have to choose between no restrictions, or they have to choose between, basically nothing from the federal government. Which is it exactly? That's a terrible political sandwich. So I think he has kind of screwed himself in either direction. I got to tell you, Krystal, I'm looking real close after we did that block on the Gavin Newsom recall election. And I am beginning to think that Newsom is in some serious, serious trouble, because when I read this poll and I saw that 16-point drop in the handling of COVID, I mean, you can't think of anybody who personifies kind of the Biden mindset on that than somebody like Newsom. He's, yes, Newsom sent out the checks and all of that, but has been pro-restriction, kind of your, prototypical mainline Democrat. So I think that he is in big, big trouble. But, staying on the, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say on Newsom, something that's interesting there, and I think also has some national implications potentially. I would say that that race by the polling right now looks like a jump ball. And as you said previously, the trend in recent years has been that the polls understate Republican support. So that's something we should take into account. Does that apply in California or not? We don't really know. But his approval rating is actually quite strong. Last poll, 57%. So he's significantly above water. But the question for the recall is who is going to show up? Who is motivated? And that's why the polls, in terms of asking the question, should we recall Gavin Newsom as governor? That's why it's basically split 50-50 as a little bit of an edge, but it's within the margin of error. That's basically where things stand right now, even though overall, if you ask people, his approval rating is actually relatively good. So it's a question of the people who are most motivated, who are most opposed to those restrictions, are the ones who are likely to show up to the polls. That dynamic could play out again in the midterm elections. The last thing I wanted to say is, I think we have one more Axios tear sheet we can put up here about the fact that 62% do not think that the Afghan war was worth fighting. And actually, way more people are concerned now about domestic extremist groups than international extremist groups, which is a whole other conversation.
Yeah, that's a whole other block.
Later, 63% don't think the Iraq war was worth fighting. So basically, the same as Afghanistan. And in the NBC News poll that you cited to start with, the number who say that the war was not worth it is the same now as it was in 2014. So yes, people are looking at these images. They're looking at the completely insane media coverage, which you're going to talk more about later. And they're not happy with how this particular withdrawal has gone. Do they support getting out of Afghanistan? Hell yes, they do. So entirely possible that over time, as some of these more heart-wrenching images fade from memory, that people come to really respect what Joe Biden has done here in contrast to what every other commander-in-chief in the past 20 years has been able to accomplish.
I think that's fundamentally going to be the dynamic. I did that whole monologue on Saigon. Everybody thought Saigon was a disaster. The next month, Gerald Ford's approval rating hit an all-time high, with the number one achievement being given to Ford, that he got Americans out of Vietnam. So I think that we are very much going to be repeating the same dynamic. And to keep, when you're watching the polling and you're watching how the media is spinning it, dig in and actually look at where exactly the drop is coming from and think about what the real political consequences of that are.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.